Your life is your greatest work of art, and it all relates back to the synchronicity. Welcome to Integrate Yourself. I'm your host, Allison Pillow, and you can find me at AllisonPillow.com and finally thrivingprogram.com. Today, I'm here with a very special guest, Paul Levy. He is a pioneer in the field of spiritual emergence, a wounded healer in private practice, assisting others who are also awakening to the dreamlike nature of reality. He has written 3 books on the Wetiko mind virus. His most recent book is Undreaming Wetiko, Breaking the Spell of the Nightmare Mind Virus. He's the founder of the Awaken in the Dream community in Portland, Oregon. He's an artist and he is deeply steeped in the work of Carl Jung and has been a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner for close to 40 years. You can find him at awakeninthedream.com. Paul, thank you so much for being on. I'm so glad you're here. We've made a personal connection in Portland, Oregon. And so I am honored that you were wanting to be on my show as well. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy and excited to be here with you today, Allison. So thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. Uh, You've written so many books about Wetiko, and you have shared also with me some of your personal experiences that you've written about in some of your books as well. You've written everything from information about the quantum field to to Wetiko, this mind virus that if people don't know, we're going to talk about that today and share more about what that is. But this is something I'm feeling like most definitely throughout the last couple of years we've been needing to really know more about, because up until now it's pretty much been hidden. So I'd love for you to start by just sharing what Wetiko is with my
Yeah.
audience and how you came to realize what Wetiko was in your life as well and your experience in
Yeah,
the
yeah.
outside world.
Yeah, for sure. No, thank you. So it's a Native American term, and Wetiko really connotes, it's like a virus of the mind, and it's a cannibalistic spirit that's really the source of all of the evil that we're playing out in our personal lives collectively as a species. But I point out, so I'm just a translator, because every spiritual tradition, it's not just Native Americans, that's they came up with the word Wetiko, but every spiritual tradition and visionary artists, thinkers, philosophers throughout history have been pointing at Wetiko, but just in different names. And so I'm just a translator. It's not like, oh, I've discovered something. No, I'm just translating this indigenous ancient term into a modern psychological idiom so that we can understand it. And I point out that Wetiko, it's a quantum phenomena. And what I mean, just like if you have light, what is the nature of light? Well, it's a wave or a particle, depends how you observe it. Wetiko being a quantum phenomena, it contains the deepest evil, and it's in a superposition of states. It also contains its own vaccine, its own medicine. And not only does it contain its own cure, but it actually is catalyzing the evolution of our species and helping us to wake up. So what Wetiko is, it's like this form of this revelation, but if we don't recognize it as a revelation, it will kill us. And the origin of Wetiko is within the human psyche. And when people hear about a mind virus, some people think, oh, that's all woo-woo and new agey and, just this gobbledygook. But what it really means is that the origin of the collective madness, because Wetiko is a form of collective psychosis, the origin of the collective madness that we're playing out all over the world is to be found within the psyche. And that's a no-brainer. Like, where in the world else could it be found? And so Wetiko, just to give a real essential articulation of it, it's a virus of the mind. It's like this vampiric spirit that feeds off of our own energy. In the Bible, in the apocryphal text, they talk about Wetiko. They call it the counterfeiting spirit. So it puts us on, it impersonates us. It offers us like this false version of ourselves. Oh, I'm limited, I'm wounded, I'm traumatized. And if we're not awake in that moment and we identify with its version of ourselves, then it has us. Then it can manipulate us and control us. But as long as we're in touch with our true nature, it has no currency over us at all. And so Wetiko, it's a form of this blindness. It's a psychic blindness, but it's a very peculiar form of blindness. in that it actually thinks it's sighted and it doesn't know it's blind. And not only that, it thinks it's more sighted than people who actually see. So Wetiko, it operates through, it covertly operates through the projective tendencies of the mind, because we're always projecting onto the waking inkblot, but in such a way that we hypnotize ourselves by our own genius, our own creative genius, in a way gets turned against us in a way. You can think of it like we create this cocoon around us and we suffocate and we're actually killing ourselves. And that this process I'm describing is getting played out writ large on the world stage. But what I'm pointing at is that encoded in the revelation, in the Wetiko mind virus that's killing us, because clearly we're enacting collective suicide on the planet. I mean, that's a no-brainer. But encoded in our acting out, and this gets mapped on collectively and individually. Think about people with addictions, or in trauma, they're acting out their addiction, they're re-traumatizing themselves, but encoded in the acting out of their addiction or their trauma, they're actually trying to unconsciously experience something consciously so as to free themselves from that malady. That's a way of describing Wetiko, that we're acting it out as a way of actually becoming conscious of it. And when we do, that's when all of a sudden the energy that it was using against us to empower its nefarious agenda and to destroy us, all of a sudden that same energy becomes available for us to express ourselves creatively with love and compassion. So it's a very profound idea. Like I'm saying, I'm just a translator. And how I came to this was in my own life. This isn't just, oh, I have like this abstract idea. No, I'm 67. And when I was in my early 20s, I'm an only child. And, without going into the story, my father was the one, I didn't have any conception of this, but he was taken over by his unconscious because he wasn't dealing with his abuse and just enacted it on the next of kin, like a lot of people do. And being the only child, I was the recipient of that, and it almost killed me. It was so intense, and it wound up that the suffering that resulted, it catapulted me in so deeply inwards that I had. This was in 1981, so I was like 24 at that point, that I had a life-transforming spiritual awakening that immediately got me thrown in mental hospitals, because from the consensus point of view, the mainstream reality, I had had a radical personality change, and I was realizing, oh my God, we're having a collective dream. And I was so excited. No way could you be, at least I wasn't prepared for that realization. And I was just so excited about what I was realizing that it freaked people out. And within a day, I got thrown in my first mental hospital, and all the doctors, and I probably got put in hospitals another 4 or 5 times during that next 18 months. And every single doctor was, oh, you have this newly discovered chemical imbalance, and it's since come out. The same authors of the DSM-3, which had come out in 1980, years later came out and said, oh, we confess, we're sorry. There's actually no such thing as a chemical imbalance. We just made that up. I mean, I have the quotes, the same doctors who wrote the DSM-3, they were saying the pharmaceutical companies, it was their marketing campaign to sell more drugs, to make more money. But when they were telling me that I was mentally ill, I was diagnosing them, going, oh, they're just incredibly ignorant. I never for a second bought in to that I was ill, because it was made very clear to me that I was having an awakening. But it was unbelievably difficult, because then I got so traumatized by the psychiatric system, and I began to realize the same sort of this dark force that was coming through the person of my father. I was recognizing, wait a second, this is the same force, almost like it's non-locally pervading the field, that was coming through the system of psychiatry. And then, like iterations of a fractal that are internested within each other, I began to realize, wait, that's the same darker force that's playing itself out collectively in the world's body politic. That's when I began to have the initial sort of like understanding of the revelation that was being shown to me, that could have absolutely killed me. And it destroyed my mother. It killed both my parents. Haven't had a family for 20 some odd years, because all of the relatives bought into my father's version of, oh, Paul's just in denial of his mental illness. And so, I've had to deal with that. But the point is that what I'm writing about, it's not just like a theory. it's come out of my own experience. Yeah.
Yeah. That's wow. Thank you for sharing that, Paul. And I know that you write about that in your book too, and you explain a lot. You share that story a lot in I think I know I was reading the Undreaming Wetiko and your Wetiko book, the one before that. So
Right.
I remember reading about that, and yeah, that's amazing that you were able though to see so clearly that where your truth was within all of that, and still be able to heal. So that's really
Yeah.
an
Well, when you say
incredible
heal, keep in
story.
mind, I'm still a work in progress. I mean,
Yeah.
it's, I'm still assimilating and metabolizing, because it was like having a direct encounter with archetypal evil, not just personal evil, but, the evil that's portrayed in myths and fairy tales. And yeah, and I just want to say the only way I was able to not subscribe and buy into the authority figures of the psychiatrist, their version of me. I remember one time in one of the last hospitals, they had a big conference with all the psychiatrists in the hospital and me. And they were saying, oh, we're all in agreement that you're mentally ill, Paul, and you'll have this illness the rest of your life. And you're going to need to be on medication until your dying breath. And I just openly said to them, you have no idea what you're talking. Here I'm like locked up in a psychiatric ward. And
Wow.
I was saying to them, you have no idea what you're talking about. You're incredibly ignorant. And of course, that just fed into their diagnosis that I'm mentally ill, that I would respond that way. But it was just, it couldn't have been made more clear in my own mind that I was having an awakening. So what they were saying, it never, not even for a nanosecond, did I invest it with any truth.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Yeah. That's incredible. And as you were talking as well in the very beginning about Watigo, it reminded me of, and also would like to ask you this question. Is it, is it basically an entity, an energy without a body that keeps going from, like a trickster energy kind of thing?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
totally. I would
Yeah.
say it's a seeming entity, not just an entity, but we subjectively experience it as if it's an entity. So subjectively, our experience when we're encountering Watiko in our own minds, we subjectively experience it as if it's an actual self-existing other alien entity.
Right.
But, from the ultimate sense, and I point this out in my work, that it has actually no reality. It doesn't even exist. There's no such thing as Watiko, and yet it can kill us. That's the paradox, that it has no intrinsic independent existence separate from our own consciousness. And that's in Buddhism, that's what's called emptiness. And emptiness is like, in Buddhism, that's the analogy to like God, is that, when you realize the empty nature of the universe and of yourself and of your experience. And so, yeah, it has no, so to say it's an entity is unconsciously by our words, investing it with a reality that it doesn't deserve. Because if we,
Right.
so if our listeners hear, oh my God, there's this mind virus and it's an entity, they'll
Yeah.
be afraid, and
Right.
them being afraid is superfood for Wetiko. So then they're colluding in actually conjuring up this seeming entity that will destroy them if they don't recognize what it's revealing about ourselves. And it's actually showing us the profound importance of the psyche in creating our experience, in creating world events. So, it's really tricky talking about this stuff, because like I'm saying, subjectively, we experience it as if it's an entity. From the ultimate point of view, it doesn't even exist. But if we say, one of the mistakes people make, I've seen this, is they just immediately identify with the ultimate absolute point of view. Oh, Watiko doesn't exist. There's nothing to be afraid
Right.
of.
That would
Oh,
be my
it's
next
like if there's a
question.
cholera.
Yeah.
Yeah, if there's a
Yeah.
cholera epidemic in the next town, and if we just say, oh, cholera doesn't exist, and we don't take precautions, it'll kill us. So if we think Watiko, if it doesn't exist, then it will kill us. If we think it does exist, then we're empowering it, with its unwarranted power, and then it'll kill us. So but the thing that so this is the conundrum that I'm
Yeah.
continually circumambulating in my work. But Watiko is this dreamed up phenomena, and I'm all like, when I had the realization in 1981, oh my God, we're having a collective dream. And just like in a night dream, you can have this lucidity and recognize, oh, I'm inside of my psyche. This is all my own energy. The same thing, the same understanding can happen in our waking dream. And then you begin to see, oh yeah, we've been programmed and conditioned based on our unconscious stuff to dream up this collective epidemic like we see in the world today. But that's what I keep on pointing at. It's a revelation.
Yeah.
And if
Yeah.
we actually recognize what it's showing to us, then all of a sudden the energy that's bound up to compulsively conjure up this insanity and the evil we're playing out in the world, all of a sudden that energy becomes available for us to express ourselves with love and compassion and by being creative.
Yeah, exactly. I see it as um something that we experience. Well, it sounds like we're creating it first of all. And then if we're creating it, then if we're seeing it, we're acknowledging that it exists without giving our power away to it, then we're actually able to transmute it. So we're able to in a way, I think, if we can take full responsibility for ourselves and not, like you said, be afraid of it or let it take over, and then it's not needed anymore, right? In a way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right, exactly. That's why the title of my new book is Undreaming Wetiko. It's exactly that. It's like when you realize you're creating it, you can uncreate it. When you realize it's a dreaming phenomena, you can undream it. And what I'm pointing out in my work is that this realization is available to all of us right now. And one way of imagining it, just imagine being in a dream, right? In a night dream, and you have lucidity and you realize, oh my God, this is all this. I thought it was objectively real and I was just being conditioned by the forms of the dream. But when you have the lucidity, what you recognize is that, wait a second, this isn't outside of myself. This is my own energy. I'm actually inside of my own psyche. Well, that's one person, one dream character in that dream having that realization. What if we imagine that other dream characters, which are just aspects of ourselves in that night dream, they're also having realization of that same understanding? And imagine, and all of this is via the creative imagination. And then imagine that you and other of your dream characters, parts of yourself in the night dream, hang out together and trip out and contemplate what we're realizing. Oh my God, this dream is manifesting in such a problematic, dark, crazy way because we've been programmed and we've been conditioned to dream it that way. When you connect with other people who are realizing that, what you discover is what I call our sacred power of dreaming, in which you realize, not intellectually, but experientially, we can put our lucidity together and change the dream. We can dream a dream that's more in alignment with who we're discovering ourselves to be, which is not the separate self. Because Wetiko, one simple way of understanding it is that it's when we're identifying with a separate self, with an artificial self, which is not who we are. And then we spend the rest of our lives investing all of our energy in protecting and defending this separate self that doesn't even exist. That's
Yeah.
insane. That's what Wetiko is. But when you actually realize, you see through that illusion and you connect with other people who also see through that illusion and recognize, oh my God, we're interdependent, we're interconnected. And you discover, oh my God, we can change the dream. And what that is, that's to consciously step into and participate in our own evolution. And that's available to us not in just in the night dream, but in the waking dream. That's what this is all about. What's happening in the world is an initiatory ordeal. And and everything depends if we have the recognition of what's being revealed to us.
Yeah, absolutely. We went through a huge initiation and I feel like what you're talking about has been happening. We have been people have been waking up and we have had this collective dream and things have gotten better, I feel like in many ways. But we're still working on it. We're still working on this, this collective dream here. And it's that illusion of separation that is really unnatural, and we've just been taught that a lot of things that we're living in are which are very unnatural are normal, and, but what we're
Right,
learning
right.
is, yeah, it's
Yeah.
not.
Well, that's
Yeah.
what happens. There's the physicist David Bohm has a phrase, an illusion generating illusion. And in a way, that's as soon as we see, once we identify with being a separate self, which is an illusion, that illusion generates a whole host of other illusions that just self-reinforce each other. Or one way of understanding that is, like in the quantum physics book that I wrote, I point out that quantum physics has empirically proven that there's no such thing as an objective world separate from our consciousness. And I can go into that a lot. I mean, I've written a book about it, but the idea is that subjective hallucination of that the world exists objectively feeds into and reinforces the illusion that we exist as a subject. Because as soon as we think the world is an object, well, then what co-arises immediately is us as a subject that's in relationship to the object. But quantum physics is pointing out, oh, it makes no sense at all to talk about the world existing objectively. That's just an idea in our mind with no correlate to reality. And when you have that realization of that there's no world objectively out there, well, what happened to the subject? Because we as a subject need an object to be in relationship to in order to be a subject. But once you realize there's no object, who am I? You see, that's where quantum physics, which is actually offering the medicine for Wetiko in the way I just described, it's promoting itself to become a spiritual path.
Yeah, yeah. So I hear you saying we are if we're, what we're observing is what we're perceiving as a reality. Is that what you're saying in a way?
Yeah. Well, we
Yeah.
become entranced by our unconscious creative genius for invoking reality. And one way of understanding this, once again, is through the imagination. Say
Right.
if I'm in a dream, right? And I'm holding a perspective in the dream. Well, what is the dream? But it's a reflection of my own mind. So if I'm holding a particular point of view, then the dream, which is nothing other than a projection of my mind or reflection of how I'm viewing, the dream instantaneously has to just offer all the evidence confirming the viewpoint I'm holding, because the dream is nothing other than reflecting our own mind. And now I have evidence in the dream that what I'm seeing objectively exists, because the dream has shapeshifted and offered me all the proof and confirmation that it is out there. So then I become even more entrenched and fixed in my viewpoint that what I'm seeing is objectively true. So I see it that way even more. And the dream just, endlessly reflects that back in such a way that I entrance myself. I've literally hypnotized myself. And the origin of that process is within my own mind. And that's a complete description of Wetiko, that you see, it has no creativity at all, but it's a master impersonator. So to the extent that we're not awake to our own creativity, it plugs into our own creativity and turning it against us. That's why, again and again, I point out that, there are a lot of ways I talk about what's the medicine for Wetiko, seeing through the objective reality illusion, or developing compassion, recognizing the dream. All of those are facets of the jewel of the medicine to heal Wetiko. But the other facet is to connect with the creative spirit, because who we are is creative, or another way of saying the same thing, because I'm endlessly just finding, these new ways of articulating the same realization that I'm trying to get out to people, because I see this is medicine, is that one of the ways of really protecting yourself against Wetiko is to be who you actually are, is to be in touch with your nature. Well, that's such a cliche, though. What does that mean?
Yeah.
And I point out, well, what is our nature? Our nature, by its very nature, is creative. And so when you have the realization of your nature, you embody and express yourself creatively. And the more you do that, the deeper you have the realization of your nature in a positive feedback loop that creates light upon light. And that's why, I was saying before, when Wetiko, which is the counterfeiting spirit, it offers us a false version, oh, you're traumatized or whatever, of who you are. And I said, yeah, if we're not awake and we identify with its version, then it has us. But if we at that moment are awake, that false version, we see through that illusion. And it even deepens our realization of who we are. And, so that's really what this is all about, that any of us individually can really stabilize and to deepen our, experience of our nature. Then in a way, we're embodying the medicine, because that becomes contagious, and then that can go viral.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with that. Yeah. I've experienced that as well. The creative aspect, when we tap into that, we do begin to really connect with our authentic self, what's true for us. And also, you kind of experience yourself in different ways, more and in that innocence, like that connecting with the innocence within through your creative powers, and through those creative expressions, I feel like is the way to get to know yourself, especially if you haven't really, if you've just been going through the motions or identifying too much with some trauma and those kinds of things, and I haven't been
Yeah.
stuck in that. So it's opening yourself up to something greater, more than just like you're saying, that limited kind of
Yeah.
suffocating self,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that you're so
Yeah. It's
much
like
more than that. Yeah.
we have what I point out again and again in my books is that we, each one of us, on the one hand, we all have been conditioned to feel powerless or helpless with what's happening in the world. Oh, there are 8 billion of us. I'm only one person, and that's really dangerous when you fall into that place of despair and pessimism and helplessness. But I point out again and again that each one of us has this unimaginably vast creative power. And I'll give you an example. Like, say if people come to me and they'll say, oh, I'm not creative, or I'm not in touch with my creativity, or I'm blocked, or feel resistance or stuck or whatever. And I get that. I mean, any creative person has to navigate that feeling of resistance. I mean, that's part of the whole gig. But I try to point out to people, because we're creating our experience every
Yeah.
moment by the way we're interpreting what's happening, by the meaning we're placing on the waking ink blot. And I try to point out to people, well, you're so incredibly creative that for some reason, you've chosen to access and express your creativity to create the experience of not being creative. And you're so unbelievably such a creative genius that you will literally conjure up the experience of not being creative. And then you'll identify with that and thinking, oh, I'm just not creative, not realizing that itself is an expression of your creative potency.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we create every day. When you wake up in the morning, you create your morning, ritual. You
Yeah.
you you know,
Right.
you decorate your house, you get dressed and you have a
Right.
schedule. You're creating all of that, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's no one else doing that.
No.
You're doing that to yourself. And that's where it involves really taking ownership and having the realization of, oh well, I'm responsible for creating my experience. And like, for example, if something seemingly, dark or challenging happens, like people who might be just absorbed in their unconscious might, right away interpret it as like, oh, this negative thing, I'm victimized, and it's a bad thing. But like somebody who might be more in touch with their nature might be like, oh wow, this is triggering me and it's painful. Wow, this is like showing me something about myself. Oh my God, this is teaching me about an unconscious part. And it's the same experience, but it's a different
Yeah.
way of interpreting it. And in Tibetan Buddhism, there are these things called the hidden treasures, the terma, and it's a real thing. One of the lineage I do practice to, that's how the lineage keeps itself fresh over the centuries, is that all of a sudden, there'll be these revelations and they'll talk about it in terms of, oh yeah, these terma, these hidden treasures are hidden and coded within the universe, and within our minds. And all of a sudden something might happen. Somebody might say something, and all of a sudden, some like a key opening up a lock, some of these people who discover these termas, all of a sudden they'll see a syllable and 20 volumes of text will just come out of their mind, and
Wow.
they'll transcribe it. And these texts are like these liberating words that other practitioners will, when they read them, it's contagious, and they'll have hidden treasures open up in their mind. And that's such an interesting, and it's a real thing. It's not just a fairy tale.
Yeah.
Scholars study this, and I've written about it. And it's all throughout my work. And I point out that you know being like a dream, this universe, well, what happens when we get one-sided in a dream? The unconscious compensates our one-sidedness by sending us symbols. That's the language of dreams, that if we get in alignment with the symbol, all of a sudden we get back in balance. And I'm pointing out that when you see this universe is dreamlike and it's very magical, there are certain hidden treasures that are coming out, like quantum physics. I point out, is a modern day analog to this idea, this Tibetan Buddhist idea of terma, that it actually is like a compensation for the one-sidedness of the scientific sort of materialist point of view, that here quantum physics is like the medicine for that. And because when you recognize, like, so what is quantum physics saying? Not only that there's nothing objective, but that the act of observing the universe actually influences the universe observed. That's a description of a dream. And when you really see, that's the rabbit hole. When you realize that, you discover, oh my God, my act of observation is creative. I'm not just a passive observer observing the separate world out there. No, but my act of observing it, just like a dream, is creating the universe I observe. So the act of observation is creative. You see, that's
Yeah.
where quantum physics is, and this is the most hardcore, rigorous science. It's showing us we have this unbelievable creative agency that we've been unconscious of. And, say, for example, if somebody came into my office today and they shared a dream they had last night, and the dream was exactly what's happening in the world, where, oh, there was just a pandemic, and then all our liberties are being taken away, and there's this fascist energy that's creeping all over the world. And and they would be describing the dream, which is exactly what's been happening in our world. And if they asked me, well, help me to interpret it, I would say, well, it's clear that you're not in touch with your creative agency, that you've outsourced it. And then the powers that be of the state or whoever are more than happy to assume your creative agency and use it against you. And what the dream is showing you is that, yeah, you need to get more consciously in touch with your creative power. And that's really all of our dream, that each one of us. And that's why if I didn't, with all the trauma and the abuse I went through with my father and with the psychiatric hospital, it could have killed me. It could have disabled me, and I was in deep, deep trouble. And then as soon as I got out of that last hospital in 82, I began having night after night the most incredible dreams. And they were showing me what was happening. And then I began recognizing in the dreams that I was dreaming and having lucid dreams, and connecting with my dreams in that way saved me. It was showing me, giving me this initiation into my own creative power. So if I didn't connect with being a creative person, and the main medium that I express myself is with my books, if I didn't connect with, just, oh yeah, I'm a creative person like we all are, I would have been in deep, deep trouble. And I'm 100% convinced the same is true for all of us, to the extent that any of us are, really familiar, with our creative process. That's the extent that it's like oxygen for the soul. It's like we're accessing medicine. But if we're not in touch with our creative power, that's like a nightmare. And that's why I call it, like I call Wetiko in the subtitle, the nightmare mind virus, because it will create nightmares both at night and in our waking dream, as is evidenced all around us. And one final thing, like people, I make a joke, I say, yeah, if I had a publicity department, they couldn't, and I do, but it's just a normal publisher publicity department. But if I had a global publicity department, they could not do a better job in publicizing my work than in what's happening in the world.
Yeah.
And if people think, so many people, when I wrote my first Wetiko book in 2013, it got published, people over the years are like, oh my God, you were prescient, you were telling the future, how did you know? And I was like, no, I not at all. I was just tuning into the deeper archetypal, sort of like matrix that was informing and giving shape to what was happening. It was just, because artists are like the canary in the coal mine.
Yeah.
They're actually giving voice, to what's beginning to happen in the collective unconscious. And and it's just been more and more people are like, oh yeah, your work maybe was a little bit ahead of its time, but now more and more people are getting, more and more people are talking about a mind virus.
Yeah.
They're using that term. And it's just obvious that the source of what's happening in our world, all the craziness, all the evil, is to be found within our minds. That's the whole idea of what I'm pointing at.
Yeah. Yeah. Because our minds are, in my experience, people want the attention of our mind constantly, right? Social media, it's like I heard this guy describe this the other day. He was like, if scrolling through social media is like reading just like the first bit of the first chapter of a book and then reading another one and another one and another one. It's just kind of like it really trains your brain to not be able to really focus on what matters to you. And so,
Right.
yeah, it's just really what we're training ourselves to do right now is just insane, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah,
And
go
just
ahead.
the short attention span that so many, particularly of the younger generation,
Yeah,
have because of, just reading like stuff on Twitter, like so many people, after they get out of high school or college, they don't ever even, the idea of reading a book is foreign to them. And in one day, because I'm really fortunate in that I have these great teachers, and one day I was with one of them for breakfast, and he just spontaneously said to me, he goes, my whole practice is to not get distracted, you know? And what he
yeah,
means is that, yeah, he has this living experience of his nature and he just doesn't forget. He just rests and abides in and as that, and everything gets integrated through that viewpoint, where there is endless distractions in our world. And and what I point out, and this is just really Tibetan Buddhism, or every wisdom tradition is pointing at it, is, yeah, you become a little bit familiar with your nature. What is our nature? It's creative, it's love, it's compassion. In Buddhism, it's called the bodhicitta, the precious bodhicitta, which is the most, that's like the highest value that the practitioner starts with. You have to cultivate the bodhicitta, which is just a good heart,
mm,
and the heart filled with love and compassion. And they say, yeah, you start when you begin practice as a beginner, that's what you start to cultivate, and then when you become enlightened, that's what you get, is the good heart, the precious bodhicitta. you know and and that's where compassion is really the dissolver of Wetiko par excellence, because compassion really is a result of snapping out of the spell of the separate self and seeing that, oh, we're all dream characters, we're all interconnected, that we actually, I depend on all of everyone for my well-being and vice versa. And when you realize that, then just in a natural way, compassion arises. And Wetiko, it like compassion is like kryptonite. So Wetiko, it has no place
right.
to stand when compassion is really there.
Yeah, it's the compassion, it's the self-acceptance, which neutralizes the power it has over people, right, in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because Wetiko, in a way, it feeds off of like self-hatred, or then if I'm not in touch with my own shadow, the psychological sort of this dynamic that underlies Wetiko, I point out, is shadow projection, is scapegoating. So if I'm not in touch with my own shadow, what happens? I project it out. And interestingly, in his work, Jung calls shadow projection the lie. And the lie, who's the liar? It's the devil. And the idea is that shadow projection is the actual shadow in action, because then we sort of try to exterminate our own shadow, our own darkness. We unconsciously project it out there. And think about a dream. If you're projecting
Oh,
out your own
yeah.
darkness out there, into the dream will walk people who carry your projection, who embody the shadow. And then, oh, you see, they really are evil. And so then you get even
Right.
more entrenched in that viewpoint that the darkness exists outside of yourself as a way of making yourself feel good and righteous and all light. And by doing that, when you amplify that process, you go to war with that person, because you're actually trying to exterminate your own darkness. And what I'm describing is that's an inner process happening in your psyche that you're playing out in the outer world, because Wetiko is an inner disease of the soul that has a magical ability to somehow extend itself out into the world and to express itself via outer events. And that's just like a dream, where the outer world is reflecting synchronistically what's happening in the inner psyche of the dreamer. And by then trying to destroy that person who's embodying your own darkness, you then become possessed by the very evil that you're trying to destroy. and
Yeah.
and that's a way, psychologically speaking, of understanding how this works. And I'm just trying to point out in as many ways as I can imagine, because Wetiko can't stand to be seen. It's a form of blindness, and when people see it, it becomes unemployed. It has no power over us when we see how it covertly operates by informing and giving shape to events in our world, the external world. and by how it, affects our reactions unconsciously in our minds. But when you begin to see that, you take away its power and you become empowered. So that's why
Yeah.
Wetiko, it's a trickster. It'll do everything it
Yeah.
can to hide itself from being seen. And I'm just saying, yeah, we need to factor all of this into our equation. We need to understand how it works. Every spiritual tradition I know, they talk about, the profound importance of connecting with our true nature. But they say, but before you do that, you have to become conscious of what is that darker force in our minds that's seemingly obscuring us. That if you don't realize that, then you have no way, you can't protect your true nature if you're asleep to the seeming darker powers in the unconscious that are seemingly against us,
Yeah.
and
It's like your blind spot. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
that's why I say that Wetiko is a form of blindness. It operates through our blind spots in a way that then entrances us. That's the
Yeah.
whole thing. And I'm trying to point out, when you shed light on that, then you become incredibly empowered.
Yeah. And I kind of laughed a little bit when you were talking about the trickster, because I have experienced that, like how tricky it can
Yeah.
be. And it's so funny how these interviews go, because I will think a question and then you will answer it without me even having to ask it. And that's what just happened, which was beautiful. I want to bring up, with what you just shared, the topic of spiritual bypassing, or in the spiritual world that's become really, and you had mentioned this from an experience you had with this woman in your book, Undreaming Wetiko, I think was the one where I remembered reading that. And then how some people in the spiritual community is becoming more and more where we're just like, no, we're not going to look at the dark. We're just going to be the
Right.
light and pretend that it's not there. And then that really, like you're saying, really feeds it more if you're not
Yeah.
acknowledging that you have that
Right.
within you
No, I
too.
have
Yeah.
that. I so have such insight into that because, I mean, we're both in Portland, and, the big spiritual bookstore in town. And, I've been on the faculty for years. They all know me, but they will not carry my Wetiko books because it has evil in the subtitle or something like that. And they're all love and light.
Yeah.
And there's nothing I can do. They're just like, it's so interesting. And I know, because one of my friends was an employee there, so he would tell me the conversations that would happen during their meetings. And he was the lobby for bringing in my Wetiko books, and the owners were like having none of it. They wouldn't even want them, in the store at all. And and I know their thinking is, oh, we don't want to like put any attention on evil because that feeds it. And that's true up to a certain point. But if we're avoiding, like, to look at evil, at the darkness, at the shadow, we're actually, what we're doing, we're avoiding relationship with a darker part of ourselves. We're turning a blind eye like an ostrich, and that feeds Wetiko by doing that. Of course, what we don't want to do, on the contrary, is become overly fascinated by evil. No, that's really feeding the evil too. But I'm pointing out, no, there's no way around. We have to see it, because remember, Wetiko is a form of blindness that operates through the blind spots. When we see it, how it works in the world, how it works in our own minds, then as a sovereign being, we can choose, saying, okay, I see you, and now I get to choose where I place my attention, and I want to invest my attention in creating the world I want to live in. See, once again, that's kryptonite to Wetiko. And so, yeah, I see this. It makes me so sad that really well-intentioned, very bright, good, open-hearted people, just do the spiritual bypassing thing, and it's tragic. It really is sad.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that, I want to bring up the topic. I don't know if you have experienced much of this, but with the whole, there's been this channeling movement. Like all of a sudden, people want to be channelers in the spiritual community, and that I'm not unfamiliar with channeling. I used to really like Abraham Hicks and all
Yeah, yeah.
the the people in the 90s and the
Yeah, yeah,
early
yeah.
2000s and all that. But I kind of feel different. I really, over the years, have, created more spiritual maturity and like see it different now. And I see it as it's not a judgment against them because, there's some really good stuff that they shared. But also, I see it almost as you're kind of abandoning yourself to let something else come in. Right. And I'm
Yeah.
thinking to myself, why? Why don't you feel powerful enough to just share it
Oh,
from your
yeah.
perspective, you
Well, it's
know?
really funny because there was one friend of mine, a good friend, and I was describing, with my books, the way I say it, I go, I just become an instrument, an open instrument for something to come through. And then after that I've written it, I'll read what I wrote and I'll be like, wow, this is really good. Who wrote this? Because I'm not identified. And one friend of
Yeah,
mine said, oh, it sounds like you're channeling. And I'm like, said to her, I go, well, I'm actually, if I'm channeling anything, it's myself. And,
exactly.
you know, and the
Yeah.
thing is, I mean, channeling is a real phenomena. It's a
Mhm.
genuine phenomena. I mean, I'm friends with the guy who wrote the definitive book on channeling, so I know a little bit about it. Um, and I go back to the work of Jung. He points out when we channel, or hear a voice or feel the spirit coming through us, he goes, it's incredibly important to discern, is it from the left stream or the right stream? In other words, is it the voice
Oh,
of wisdom or of God, or is it the deceiver? Is it the devil? Is it Wetiko? And a lot of people I know who channel, they haven't developed their discernment, because one of the things Wetiko does, it disables our discernment. And to develop discrimination, differentiation, discernment, that feeds consciousness, that feeds the expansion of consciousness. So no, I'm right with you. And that's another thing that makes me sad, that a lot of people who are plugging into something, but if they don't have the discernment, then they could be unwittingly channeling something that might not be coming from like the highest place, that could have like a real negative effect on people.
yeah, I agree. Yeah. And I agree with what you said about writing because I've had the same experience writing my book. I just was writing and not even thinking about it. It was just coming through. And I think that,
Right.
yes, we do have a lot of energetic support. There might be, we may have guides, we have a connection to source, and our higher self, it comes maybe from the higher mind. But I think that, and again, like no judgment for people, but I think I brought it up because I feel like people are just jumping right into it without what you're saying, the
Yeah.
discernment it takes to really, you
Right.
know, be
Right.
able to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So,
And the
yeah.
thing is, what you just said, it brought to mind, because I'm really into, studying Jung. I mean, when I found his work, it saved my life because I was having these completely out of the ordinary experiences. And I knew I wasn't crazy, but I was trying to contextualize it. And then I found the work of Jung, and in his, like, for example, in his autobiography, there's a chapter, The Confrontation with the Unconscious, and he was describing his experiences. And I realized, oh my God, he's like articulating exactly what I've been going through. So that really, really helped me. And you know, so what he was really after in the therapy that he devised was connecting people with their inner guidance. He had the living experience that there was an inner guide in his psyche that on one level was part of himself, but on another level was some sort of higher dimensional seeming entity that knew
Right.
stuff that Jung didn't know and was teaching him. It was like his inner guide. And
Yeah.
and that's exactly what he was trying to get across in the type of therapy he created. And he calls it the ego self axis. That, in other words, the ego, who we think we are, our conscious identification, all of a sudden, it like getting into an intimate relationship. You develop an intimate relationship with the self, with the higher self, with your totality, with your wholeness. And you more and more have this, like, dialogue and relationship, to the point where instead of just being totally opposite, they more and more, by becoming intimate, ultimately they fuse and become one. And that's just a hypothetical, if that ever happens. you know but and that totally makes sense to me, because even when I write my books, I write in the morning, and I wake up and I'm brushing my teeth and I'm getting downloads
Yeah.
about what to write about. And I've learned to differentiate between what is the voice of just sort of like, the neurotic monkey mind that I just need to ignore. That has a different energetic signature than when I'm getting a voice from, my inner guide. And it's telling me what I'm going to write about, how I'm going to write about it. And I've learned to pay attention, because then
Mm.
I'm like the employee and I'm getting the dictate from the boss. And I've really learned, oh, I need to honor that. And that's what I mean when then I go to write, and all of a sudden, like something is coming through me that I'm just a vehicle for. And when
Yeah.
I do that, it's profoundly healing for me, and it's real medicine. And that's what this is all about, is for us to connect. We all have an inner guide, but we've become so conditioned and programmed to sort of to push it to the margins and ignore it, particularly in this materialistic scientific materialistic culture, that, oh, it can't be measured, it's not quantifiable, it's not real. But what Jung says is what's real. He talks about the reality of the psyche, that's the greatest discovery of the 20th century in the realm of psychology. And what's real is what has an effect, is what works. And when you connect with your inner guide and you treat it as if it's really real, well, then it'll have very real, these life transforming effects,
Yeah. Yeah. So I find that much of what I experience sometimes doesn't even have a word to describe it, like it's just an
Right.
energy, right?
Right. It's
And
ineffable. It's a mystery. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. And yes, I agree with what you're saying. Like a lot of times I get my downloads in the shower, or when I'm brushing my teeth or doing the dishes, when I'm not like really thinking or about
Right.
anything, right? I mean, yeah, it's pretty cool. And then I have to stop and like write some things down before it just goes. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it's really kind of when you relax and you let go and you're not trying so hard, then I think that's when
Right.
it
No, that
comes.
happens to
Yeah.
me a lot. I'll be like, I'm like in the middle of an article I'm writing, and I'm like, oh, how do I solve this problem? And I don't know. And then I just go and sit in meditation, and in like
Yeah.
a minute, the answer will be there. And it reminds me, when I went to the Institute for Advanced Studies for a visit, that's where Einstein, and they just basically took all these geniuses and put them together, without any responsibilities. They didn't have to teach. They just wanted to have them hang out and see if they could, really tap into stuff. And the thing I remember, in the back of the institute was this woods, where like Einstein would go for a walk, and every 100 feet they would have like a little pad of paper nailed onto a tree with a pencil, because they didn't want Einstein or whoever to be having this revelation and not be able to like coagulate it. In alchemy,
Wow.
one of the major stages is coagulatio, is to coagulate, to take the dream or the vision, to take the spirit and turn it into earth, turn it into something. And that, what brings to mind the importance of being the artist, because the artist is somebody who tunes in. Think about that hidden treasure. They tune in to the potential, that's there in the quantum field, and they're able to somehow symbolize it in whatever medium they do, in a way that then gets transmitted to other people. And
Yeah.
that's where I'm really, really hopeful, because I feel like so many people are, tuning in because of times like this, of such extreme insanity and darkness and tension, creative tension, that something's available to us, because there's such
Yeah.
pressure in our alchemical vessels of our psyche, that some of us are able to tune in and bring forth something creative that can be incredibly psychoactivating and can have an
Yeah.
incredible effect on all of us. And like I'm saying, that can go viral, and that can actually catalyze a real deeper awakening in our species.
Yeah, yeah. Many people are talking about this that and it's going to be happening within all of us, I believe, this huge mass awakening, and as you were talking, it reminded me that when we're taking in these higher aspects of ourself, we're actually bringing into form through the body. We're embodying that through our expressions, but also physically, so I think our bodies are changing as we embody more of these higher aspects of ourselves too. But I think it hasn't until now, just because we didn't realize we could do that before. And so now, as we
Yeah, yeah,
realize
yeah.
we are the creators, we can transmute the energy, like we become, like you're saying, that transmitter to light other
Yeah.
people up. And
Well, and this
yeah,
brings to mind that there's really not a difference between the mind and the body.
that's true.
You
Yeah.
can't really separate that out. And this is the synchronistic idea that Jung came up with, where it took him over 20 years of tracking this before he was courageous enough to publish his work, because it was so out of the accepted paradigm, that the world is objective and, the physical is separate from the mental. But,
Right.
he had the realization, no, there's some sort of deeper interconnectedness between what's going on in our psyches and what's playing out in the world. And at those particular moments of synchronicity, it's like a fissure in that veil, where all of a sudden this unified field, or the unus mundus, the one world, that's the phrase he would use, is actually revealing itself. And what that means is that the dreamlike nature is showing itself to us through those synchronistic phenomena. And the thing which is wild is that, and I'll talk to my materialist friends and they're just like, oh, that's just accidental, that's coincidental. But the more we have moments like that where we see the interfacing, between psyche, or spirit, or the mind and matter, that the two are inseparable, the more we actually take that in and have experiences like that and take that online into our psyche, the more synchronicities we have,
Yeah.
and so I point out that in the Undreaming Wetiko, there's a big chapter on synchronicities, and I point out that to develop this synchronistic awareness, and that's the step out of, that sort of bifurcation of mind and matter
Yeah.
and of us as separate selves, the more we establish ourselves in that synchronistic awareness, or another way of saying it, symbolic awareness, because symbols being the language of dreams, so we can interpret our waking life as if it's a dream, that the universe is an oracle. The more we establish ourselves in that viewpoint, the more we're able to naturally dispel Wetiko.
Yeah. And be more natural in our true nature, like you said before.
Right, because the
Yeah.
thing about Wetiko, when it really gets in, and it's in the collective unconscious, so we all have it in potential. I mean, think about it. We've all, who hasn't fallen into their unconscious and acted stuff out? We all have. So if I think, oh, that person has Wetiko and I don't, that point of view
Yeah.
is
Right.
showing I'm under the spell of Wetiko. But what happens when somebody, in a way unconsciously becomes identified with a Wetiko or taken over by it? They become like a robot. They become totally programmed like an automaton. Think about
Yeah.
AI,
AI.
and
Yeah.
and they become like an embodiment of this robotic. They're just a series of program responses with no creativity, programmed in.
Right.
And that's why, when I meet people who have an open heart, or really creative, or in touch with their soul, which is something, it's a palpable feeling, they're like embodying, like what it's like to sort of be Wetiko free, as compared to people, I think of my father. He would say something in a particular, situation like 25 years earlier, and then fast forward 25 years, and the same situation would happen, and he would literally, like a play button just got hit on the tape recorder. He would just literally say the same words he said in response 25 years ago, and that was,
Wow.
he was just completely programmed, and he had no idea. He was, so that's the thing. When I say it's an inner disease of the soul that actually has a magical ability to extend itself in the world and configure events to reflect back the inner state of the psyche, you know it's like, it's so much, where the inner becomes the outer, where we are literally playing out our inner unconscious unhealed abuse. It's getting dreamed up and it's playing out in the world, but it's revealing itself to us. Like, it's the quantum, it's the superposition of states, where it's like the problem, it's the pathology, but it's also showing us our unconscious. And of course, once again, everything depends on, if we recognize what's being shown to us.
Yeah. It's a gift if you look at it like that, to be able to see that for yourself.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But if you don't recognize the gift, then it just assumes it's program response of
Oh,
destroying us.
right, right, right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah. It's kind of like it does remind me of like an AI technology that doesn't have any consciousness so much, but maybe just
Yeah,
gets
yeah, yeah.
and
And that's why the
consumes,
importance,
Yeah.
that's why the importance of for us to really connect with our nature, with our heart, with our soul, with our creativity, with our love and our compassion, and don't underestimate the power of compassion, like it's
Yeah.
the nuclear energy, because it's a real danger to get to fall. It's so seductive and convincing to fall into pessimism. Oh, we're going to hell in a handbasket and
And
things look
judgment too,
yeah,
judgment.
yeah, and
Yeah.
and judgment too, right? But the idea is we hold a pessimistic point of view, being like a dream. We're just going to attract evidence confirming our viewpoint,
Oh,
so then we'll become
right.
more fixed in our viewpoint of pessimism, and then we're part of the problem. Then we can't be part of the solution, you know. But to see, for example, quantum physics points this out really clearly. The elementary particle. So quantum physics was trying to find the microstructure of what this world was made of. Like, what are the building blocks of the universe? And as they went down, and more sort of like, in scale, they realized, oh, there's nothing physical at the bottom. It's something having to do with consciousness. And the way they would understand it, there were these elementary particles that existed in a state of potentiality up until the moment they were observed. And so in any
Oh, wow.
possible state, they existed in potentiality, and then the moment of observation, the wave function collapses, and then one of the potentialities would actualize and manifest, and all the other possibilities would vaporize, like into parallel universes. But the point is, and what
Wow.
the quantum physicists were saying, was that means, and this is like pretty much a quote, that even if something is ridiculously and highly unlikely, it could still manifest this very moment. Now, just to do a commentary on that, that is to say that at this very moment, we could have a quantum leap, and there would be a sufficient number of us in our world who are awakening to the quantum nature, the dreamlike nature, seeing Wetiko, recognizing the shadow. They're expressing themselves creatively. A lot of ways of saying the same thing. Any one of us might be, like I'll just say, like share, like one of the beautiful images Jung used, when you had a glass of water and you put dissolved sugar in the water, it would just dissolve and dissolve each grain of sugar. Then it reaches a saturation point. You add one more grain and a crystal manifests. And he would say that's the way symbols, crystallize in our psyche. And any one of us, maybe even in this moment, awakening to whatever degree, could be that grain of sugar that
Yeah.
crystallizes a global awakening in the collective unconscious. But then the quantum physicists would say, even the idea that our species could awaken, and in this moment, because that's in the realm of the possible, even though it sounds highly and ridiculously unlikely, it could be this
Yeah.
very moment that
Right.
happens. And if you're not thinking that, if you're not envisioning that, and you're like entranced by pessimism, saying, oh, that you're just magical thinking and new age woo and all that, then you're part of the problem. So
Yeah.
just that's so inspiring to hold out that the hardest core of the hardcore scientists are saying, no, it's completely within our realm, because we already have the solution. We are the solution. It's
Yeah.
like we have the Philosopher's Stone, the Holy Grail. Not only are we in possession of it, we are it. In alchemy, they say, no, the idea isn't to find the Philosopher's Stone. The idea is to become it. And we already are it. We just don't recognize that. And when enough of us see that, and maybe even one person, because what Jung is saying is that the way to heal this world situation, it's not by politics or legislation or laws. No, we as individuals are the carriers of what's happening in the world. And so any one of us doing our inner work and shedding light on you see, if we don't shed light on our darkness inside, there's no way we're going to be able to deal with the darkness in the world. But when we shed light on our own shadow, that empowers us to be able to know how to navigate evil when it plays out in the world. And so that's a very inspiring, sort of this vision. Not just Jung, so many people have had that over the centuries, and it can be really inspiring and snap people out of that curse of pessimism.
Yeah. I love that. Thanks for sharing that, Paul. That is an example of, I forget this too sometimes. I have to remind myself everything can change in an instant. And
Well,
we just have
that's what
forgotten who
happened.
we
That's
are.
what happened
Yeah.
for me when I was saying I
Yeah.
had this awakening in 1981. I didn't realize this because I had no context, but years later I realized, oh my God, I participated in a quantum jump, where like, because I was in one
Yeah.
world that I lived in
Do they
24
call
years.
those time? Is that the same as a timeline jump, a quantum jump?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think
Okay.
so.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's the same thing, an equivalent
Yeah.
term. Because what happened for 24 years, I was living in, the ordinary mainstream reality where certain things were possible and certain things were impossible. All of a sudden, I began having these experiences, and this world looked exactly the same, but it was radically different because all of a sudden the realm of the possible had expanded to unimaginable
Yeah.
degrees. And then it's taken me over 40 years of integrating what was being revealed, and I'm just so grateful that I didn't buy into, for a moment. Like, so with psychiatry, they were completely trying to convince me, that I was mentally ill, that I needed medication, blah, blah, blah. And they took my saying, no, 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 that's not at all what's happening, as just, oh, that's an expression of my pathology. But say if I did step into their timeline, and if I did say, oh, yes, I'm mentally ill and I'm like needing to be on medication the rest of my life, well, from their point of view, it would have been, oh, wow, we've had another successful treatment. The patient
Right.
has complied to our viewpoint, and it would have killed me. So what is wrong with that picture?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll say this real quick because this all reminds me of uh yeah, I've experienced that too. Of just everything changes overnight and it's like, wait a minute, this feels different. Even things look different. Okay, sorry. A little pause there.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, it reminds me of the man. Do you know the author of the book, The Man in the High Castle?
Yeah,
Are
Philip
you
K.
familiar?
Dick. Oh, I love in the Wetiko book, there's a big chapter on Philip K. Dick was totally tracking Wetiko. He called it the Black Iron Prison, and he literally said the key to everything is understanding this mimicking stuff. This
Yeah.
mimicking stuff. Wetiko is a mimic. Remember, it impersonates us. It puts us on. So yeah, no, I'm super into Philip K. Dick.
And I remember hearing something about like he actually did go to that actual timeline. He experienced it and he came back into this one. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I thought that was so interesting because I was like, wow, okay, that gives me a different perspective on how this whole thing works, because I have experienced like stepping into, but like, okay, because sometimes I'll say this real quick because I know we're coming up, we're past the hour now, but
Yeah, yeah.
I've talked to people and I know that they remember. I mean, it's like they have to remember but they don't. And it's like sometimes I'm like, wait a minute, am I in a different timeline? Because everything, it feels like people have amnesia, about what.
Right. Well, that's the thing about amnesia. There's the word anamnesia, which
Yeah.
means unforgetting, and one
Oh,
of the
right.
things they say in Buddhism, they'll have these great enlightened beings who attain enlightenment in one lifetime, and then they'll consciously choose to incarnate, instead of just by being, the images, instead of a normal person, they die and they're just, the winds of karma just blow them here and there, and they just incarnate based on their unhealed, karma. An enlightened person know they can consciously, they can choose and direct, oh, I'm going to incarnate back in this universe, and help other people to awaken. But one of the things that's most interesting, well, one of my teachers is like, that incarnation, and he was telling me, yeah, it's like having dreams on the course of an evening, and you have different dreams. And in one dream, you're a 67-year-old male. In another dream, you're like a 20-year-old woman. He goes, imagine if you keep the continuity of your awareness between those dreams at night. That's like keeping the continuity of awareness between your incarnations. But one of the things that's most interesting, they say, with those beings who incarnate and they were enlightened in the last life, they're able to, when they get taught stuff, they're able to learn really quickly because they're just remembering
Oh,
what they
yeah.
already knew. you
Yeah.
know that just really speaks to me.
Me too. Me too. Well, thank you, Paul. Before we close up, do you have any last words you want to share, especially about the next year we're coming into? Do you have any take or feeling about what we're stepping
Yeah, yeah,
into
yeah.
here?
So I
Yeah.
would just say, so what's happening in the world, it's so intense, it's unlike anything that we've ever lived through. And the images, it creates incredible creative tension, like the tension of the opposites in our mind, in the alchemical vessel of our psyche is getting, very, very intense. And instead of like, there are people I know who just become numb or just they'll split and dissociate or just try to make the best of it. If we have the inner strength or the courage, whatever the quality is, to be able to just stay with that tension, that creative tension that's getting constellated in us, and to hold that with awareness and to not prematurely just identify with one of the opposites at the expense of the other, to get away from that pain, because it can be, an agonizing experience. But if you're able to hold that, and this is kind of my practice, I do this with varying degrees of success every day, then out of that, and once again, here's Jung, he says, out of that comes the transcendent function. In other words, whose function is helping us to transcend. And all of a sudden we begin to have a vision that we as an ego didn't think of, like something we have this revelation or an insight. And that's where we can step into our creative selves and express that in whatever form we do. And I just think when the pandemic happened and the lockdown first happened, I would typically write an article every month or two. I was writing a full article every day because I was so freaked out, and realizing, oh God, what's happening? And I was just turning it into like infinite creativity day after day after day. And that was helping me keep my sanity.
Yeah,
And
I experienced the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think so that opportunity is really, it's being made available to all of us, because, if we don't, pick up that opportunity, then we just become partial and unconscious and, and develop symptoms and get depressed and pessimistic, and that doesn't serve anyone. And so that would be my last thing to sort of offer to people.
Thank you so much, Paul. And please leave my listeners with a way to find you, your website, your books, and
Sure.
whatever
No,
you want to
thank you.
share.
So
Yeah.
yeah. So real simple. If they're interested, if they want to awaken in the dream, go to awakeninthedream.com. That's my website. And it's not monetized at all. There's no paywall. The only you can, I do private sessions, or you can buy my books, but everything else, there's tons of articles and interviews. It's all for free, because I just want this information to get out, because it's medicine. And so that would be the way. And then on that, on my website, there's a contact Paul. They can send me emails or whatever. Yeah.
And you do coaching, and then I've been in one of your groups, and they're wonderful, wonderful group of people. Really enjoyed, and I'll be doing more of those. But yeah, so yeah.
Cool.
Well, thank you, Paul.
Allison,
Thanks for
thank
being
you so
on.
much for the invite.
Yeah.
This has been so much fun,
Oh,
really.
same here. Thank you so much. Your life is your greatest work of art, and it all relates back to the synchronicities.